Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 46. Staton Graham, current Earl of Reddick, was not what Hannibal expected. He was not monstrous, nor overly tall or impressive. He was, instead, a portly, scowling man with florid cheeks and an air of impatience and a very solid sense of his own worth, who strode into Hertford House with the appraising air of a man studiously cataloguing the value of everything in sight. Hannibal half expected a bevy of solicitors following in his wake to take notations, but he was quite alone.
"Lord Reddick,"
Hannibal said, his smile tightening with annoyance when the man did not immediately look at him.
"How good of you to come. I trust you had no difficulties?"
"None but the inconvenience of travel, Lord Clarges,"
Lord Reddick said, looking at Hannibal with frank disapproval.
"I have a great deal of business I had to put on hold to accept his Grace's invitation. I'm sure you find yourself in a similar position with your affairs."
"As a matter of fact, I do not. I have the luxury of being married to a man who has an excellent head for business,"
Hannibal said, his smile wolfish with delight.
"I find I never need to worry myself with the details, as Will has everything well in hand."
Staton blinked, bushy eyebrows slanting down and his mouth pursing in a spill of lines that made him appear much older than he actually was. He took his gloves and hat off with short, sharp movements, digesting that statement along with Hannibal's pleased smile.
"I do hope your visit is not too onerous,"
Hannibal said, noting Mr. Hawke's stiff distaste as he handed off Staton's gloves, hat, and walking stick to a waiting footman.
"I have been informed you rarely leave Broad River."
"By whom, Lord Clarges?"
Staton asked, straightening his clothes.
"By Mr. Ingram,"
Hannibal said, affecting innocence,
"with whom I have fallen somewhat out of contact, but you can rest assured I am keeping a very close eye on him."
"I'm sure you are,"
Staton said, his mouth pursing even more.
"I think you'll be very surprised when you see Will again. I understand you've not been to visit him since he left to come here."
Lord Reddick met his gaze directly. Closer now, Hannibal could see that Will very much favored his father. They shared the same peaches and cream complexion, dark brown curls, furrowed brow, bright blue eyes, and excessively stubborn mouth.
"I'm not in the habit of making a nuisance of myself, Lord Clarges,"
Staton said, gazing around Hertford's elegant foyer yet again.
"Proper children visit their parents, not the other way around."
"Will has been extraordinarily engaged here at Hertford. I'm afraid we've rather monopolized him,"
Hannibal said, stretching a touch taller and squaring his shoulders even as another coach rolled to a stop in the drive.
"Grandfather does rely on him greatly and could not see fit to spare him. He adores my husband nearly as much as I do, but I'm sure you anticipated such a thing would happen when you gave Will's hand to me in marriage."
Staton's frown edged into a glower, but he made no response to that. He merely patted the bulk of his belly, his rings winking on his plump fingers. Hannibal spied a sallow, nervous-looking fellow overseeing the disposal of a small trunk, presumably the servant which Aunt Margaret had remarked. Curious, he asked,
"Have you no more luggage than that?"
"I have only brought what I need to pass the night comfortably,"
Staton said, checking his pocket-watch.
"I do not intend to stay over long."
"You're here as our guest, father,"
Hannibal said, relishing the scowl that won him.
"Favor us with your company as long as you are comfortable here."
Staton replaced his watch with a frown, smoothing the cloth over top of it. His clothing was the finest that money could buy, the quality evident in the cut and embellishment, his adornments those of a man unused to denying himself anything. Hannibal recalled Will's threadbare riding outfit and shoddy boots his first morning here. He thought of the scars that laced Will's skin, and the abuse he spoke of in the calm tones of one discussing nothing more disturbing than the weather. He suddenly wanted nothing more than to skewer this plump man like a pig, roast him in a pit, and deliver his heart in tender slices to Will's waiting plate. It was a thought that left him smiling as he escorted Lord Reddick toward the parlor to see Will in all of his glory. The longer Hannibal was gone, the tighter Will's nerves wound. His ample imagination provided him multiple scenarios regarding the first meeting between his husband and his father, many of which ended in Hannibal taking impulsive action that would stir his family into a dither and send grandfather spiraling into a temper. "Excuse me, grandfather," Will said, preparing to go and check on them. "I should have never left Hannibal to his own devices."
"Will, please do stay,"
Grandfather said, disengaging from Uncle Robert to call after him.
Hannibal will control himself, my dear. There's nothing to worry about on that count.
Even still... Will cut off as Mr. Hawkes opened the door, and Hannibal came through, his slight, satisfied smile immediately suspect. He held Will's gaze for a long moment, the silent support he offered bolstering Will from within. Hannibal's outpouring of pride reminded Will that he was no longer a scared, abused child. Not anymore, not like he had been.
"We are hosting a party this evening, William,"
Father said, sparing a look at him, eyes sharp enough to cut.
"I want you to stay upstairs."
Upstairs? Will echoed, tensing when his father's eyes narrowed.
"Is there a problem?"
Father asked, disapproval heavy in his rumbling voice. No, only, Mina's attending, and I thought perhaps you would permit me to attend as well."
"You will not be attending,"
Father said, steepling his fingers beneath his chin.
"The confusion you present to our guests makes them uneasy, William. People dislike being uncomfortable, and that is precisely what you make them. Creatures like you, things which refuse definition and cannot be parsed into sense, are unsettling for the rest of us. Your presence would only disturb them unnecessarily."
Will flinched, dropping his gaze before his father's, but he could not keep from saying, "You make me sound like a monster."
"You're not a monster, William. Merely a regrettable mistake."
Will closed his eyes against the stab of pain that statement still caused him. The man in his memory blurred into the present, a hulking, shimmering shadow whispering how he was less, how he was different, how he was a slap in the face of nature because of the way she herself had designed him. A mistake, an embarrassment, a failure.
"I am rich in treasure with you, Will. Should every fortune I have reverse, I could withstand the pain of it, if only I have you near me."
It blossomed through the darkness with the sudden brilliance of the sun breaking through the clouds, chasing away the doubt that threatened to seep in. The earthy flavor of Hannibal's alpha scent wrapped around him like an embrace, and Will opened his eyes, reaching out for the hand that met his own, fingers tightening and back straightening. He had worked far too hard for far too long to doubt his own strength now. He was Lord Clarges in his own right, master of Hertford House, and poised to become a duke at Hannibal's side, and no one, not fate, not gossip, and certainly not Staton Graham, could ever take away what he had accomplished these past 6 years.
"And who do we have here?"
Roland asked, beckoning Staton closer with one elegant hand.
"May I present Lord Reddig, grandfather?"
Hannibal said, slipping against Will's side to sandwich him between the two Lecter Alphas. Though the rest of their guest gave no indication of taking notice, Hannibal could feel the steady gazes of his family on Staton Graham, curious and assessing.
"Lord Reddig, his Grace, the Duke of Westvale."
"Staton,"
Roland said, taking advantage of his position to forego civility.
"I assumed you would come earlier to visit with Will before dinner. Did your coach throw a wheel?"
"No, your Grace, it did not," Staton said, annoyance flashing across his face.
"Well, there is always next time. I expect my husband needs no introduction."
Staton turned his head, distaste falling over his features like a gossamer veil, once more face to face with the child he'd damaged so greatly and for so long. Hannibal's hand squeezed his, and Will grasped it tightly, nails biting into flesh as he looked at the Alpha he had once called father, the familiar whiskey and menthol scent of him churning Will's stomach as it invaded his lungs. But the man Will remembered was not the one who stood before him. He looked older, the lines that framed his eyes, nose, and mouth etched even deeper, his bitterness carved into his flesh for all the world to see. The gray in his hair had gone white where it shaded his temples, and he seemed smaller, somehow, a monster dragged out into the light to reveal his true shape.
"Well?"
Lord Reddig asked, impatient. "Welcome to Hertford House, Lord Reddig," Will said, and Hannibal stirred at his side, a gentle reminder that he was ready and willing to spring to his defense. "I hope you are every bit as comfortable and happy here as I ever was in your home, and please call me Lord Clarges. I prefer only my close family use my given name." Staton glared, but Will only returned it with a placid, heavy-lidded stare, his chin tilted in a hint of the strength he had garnered these past 6 years, flanked on both sides by men who held more personal power in their pinky fingers than Staton Graham would ever hold in his life.
"I thought you might refuse my invitation,"
Grandfather said, pleased with Will's response and not bothering to hide it.
"All things considered,
Staton flushed, blue eyes flicking from Will's impassive face to Hannibal's predatory smile, and back to grandfather once again.
"It's been over 30 years, hasn't it?" grandfather pressed. "I haven't seen you suffered any lack in the meantime." "Not any more," Staton said, his hand almost straying to his paunch. "Though paying Will's dowry put me deeply in debt."
"That is unfortunate to hear,"
Hannibal said, feeling Will stiffen at his side.
"I seem to recall Lady Rathmore married the summer after Will and I did. How very gallant of Lord Rathmore to take a bride without compensation, especially one such as your daughter."
"How long will you be staying with us?" Will inquired, speaking up to prevent his father from responding to Hannibal's jibe.
"Only 1 night, Lord Clarges,"
Staton said, fondling his watch again as if time might move faster for the touch.
"As the son of my dearest, most intimate friend, and as the father of my beloved grandchild, I had every expectation you would accept my invitation in its entirety,"
grandfather said, mouth pressed tightly with disapproval.
"If you accepted it all." "I have no wish to make an inconvenience of myself,"
Staton sharply said, attempting to soften it with,
"Your Grace." "Nonsense, Staton,"
grandfather said, irritation hardening his tone.
"How on earth could you ever inconvenience me more now than you did in the matter of your father's failing health? You'll stay for as long as my darling grandchild enjoys your company. I insist."
"Your Grace, I really must decline." "If you are no more eager to burden us with your presence than we are to be burdened by it, then why have you come?"
"Honestly?"
Staton asked, casting another glance around.
"To see the place I should have sent your sister."
As if on cue, Mina breezed toward them from the mingling guests, a bright-faced angel with her arms extended.
"Papa, how good it is to see you! Ah, you are here at last! I have been ever so busy!"
She hurled herself at Staton with a marksman's aim, and Will could almost thank her for the distraction as she bore their father off. He took advantage of the clamor she made to whisper to his husband, "I wish you had not invited him."
"Blame grandfather."
"Hannibal, you know as well as I do we could hardly have a gathering in honor of your marriage without inviting Will's relations."
Family, Will noted, was not a term either his husband or grandfather used in reference to Staton Graham, and he was deeply grateful.
"Even should he decide to stay, Will, don't let it worry you,"
Hannibal murmured, tipping his head just enough to speak the words into Will's ear as grandfather exchanged quiet words with Anthony.
"You've no reason to be afraid of him, not any more."
"I'm not afraid of him," Will said, the realization surprising him into thoughtful frown. "I was never truly afraid of him, only of the power he held over me. I saw his failings and understood them." He turned his head just enough to hold Hannibal's eye. "I think that was why he was so brutal with me. He was embarrassed to be seen for what he truly is."
"You never gave him what his pride imagined he was due. I wonder what his pride makes of seeing you now. I hope he's strangling on it."
He followed the words with a soft kiss to Will's temple, a final indulgence before their next guests arrived. A trilling, lilting voice called out to them as Mr. Hawkes opened the door, the words incomprehensible to Will, but making Hannibal say with delighted surprise,
"Aunt Aldana! The Honourable Lord and Lady Miškinis, Your Grace."
Mr. Hawkes announced, granting access to a stately couple in whom Will could see the echoes of Hannibal himself, as well as the resemblance to his mother.
"Your Grace,"
Lord Miškinis said, executing a sharp courtly bow that spoke of endless hours in the presence of royalty.
"My wife and I have come in the name of their Graces, the Duke and Duchess of Keskilos. Well, thank you for your invitation, but sadly are unable to travel."
Hannibal tipped his head down toward Will's while grandfather made his greetings and whispered,
"My Uncle Thomas and my mother's sister, Aldana. I didn't expect they would come. Brace yourself, she is given to excessive affection."
"Excessive?" Will yelped softly as slender arms coiled around him and smothered him against a rather healthy bosom, with strength enough to lift him partially off his feet. The scent of her perfume was dizzying enough to make him sway slightly when she released him and seized his face in her beringed hands to peer down at him. "You are real. We have waited so long, haven't we waited, Hannibal?" Aldana asked, giving him an expectant, disapproving look that had grandfather grinning.
"Aunt Aldana, please,"
Hannibal said, attempting to detach her from his bemused mate. With a resigned sigh, he said,
"Will, this is my Aunt Aldana, my Uncle Thomas. Aunt Aldana, Uncle Tomas, this is Will, my spouse.
You are very beautiful, she crooned, and rubbed her nose to Will's briefly before flinging herself around to rattle off another rapid sentence to her husband, who nodded and smiled at them both. Shame on you, Hannibal. How many years since visited your grandparents? They are not young any longer.
I know, Aunt Aldana.
And they long to see your bride, Hannibal. They want the little ones to visit, she insisted, pinching Hannibal's cheeks with force enough that he winced, immediately reduced to recalcitrant child in her presence. She smiled at Will as she did so and purred. Remind me to tell you of the time.
Thank you, Aunt Aldana, if you please,
Hannibal said, shooing her off before she could say anything incriminating, the red in his cheeks not wholly the result of her grip.
Will has many years ahead of him to hear of my misspent youth.
Not if you never bring him to visit, she pointed out, wrinkling her nose in startling similarity to her nephew. She smiled at Will again and patted his cheek, warm and affectionate, promising, "We can speak later." "Of course," Will said, taken aback when he was embraced again. He stared after them, half in awe, as they moved to reacquaint themselves with the elder Dimmins, taking no notice of Will's father, stuffed into the corner and glowering.
Excessively affectionate,
Hannibal said, steadying Will with one warm hand to his lower back.
I did try to warn you.
You didn't try hard enough, Will said, surreptitiously waving the remnants of her perfume away. Pleasant as it was too strong for his tastes and stung his nose. Heavens, I should have applied myself to your mother's native tongue. I never expected to meet your relatives from abroad.
I can teach you. I spent whole summers with them in Lituva growing up. There were no concessions made for lack of understanding. I learned the language very quickly indeed, starting with the food. The Marquess and Marchioness of Warrington,
Mr. Hawkes announced, bringing more guests through their door.
Goodness, it is you, Staten Graham. I had wondered who on earth was in the drive carrying on. Why in the world are you lurking in that corner? You frightened someone might see you?
Aunt Margaret's voice rose above the low noise of conversation only briefly, but Will closed his eyes and took a breath, reaching out to anchor his fingers against Hannibal's side.
God's help us,
Hannibal breathed, rubbing his hand down Will's spine and heaving a sigh of weary expectation for what was to come. It was, Will knew, going to be an extremely long night, and it hadn't even properly started yet. The greetings were over in due time, and Mr. Hawkes announced the dinner hour. Grandfather retired first, and the guests were all shown to their rooms by staff to prepare themselves for their repast, leaving Hertford House to fall quiet in preparation for the evening meal. Will was pensive and distracted as Jimmy dressed him in the clothing Nicola had suggested, his thoughts snared on his father and the unease he still inspired. He took little notice as the layers were added from his stockings up, encasing him in finery designed to celebrate the beauty unique to his gender. The colors were chosen with care, his breeches a fine brushed fawn hemmed in layers of matching lace and tied with dark blue ribbons. The patterned pearlescence of his stockings hugged the contours of his calves, their shapeliness emphasized by the low-heeled shoes Jimmy slipped on his feet. With his white blouse, embroidered royal blue vest, and pale green jacket fastened into place, he felt as a knight armed for war. When Jimmy stepped back to bear him to the looking-glass, what Will saw gazing back at him was neither a man nor a woman, but a drowsy-eyed beauty with tousled dark curls and a graceful figure showed to every advantage by the clothing Nicola had chosen for him. He was an Omega, beautiful and fluid and in the prime of youthful bloom, and he absolutely could not wait to see the look on his father's face when he saw him. Jimmy selected the watch from his collection and fastened it in place, tucking it into his pocket and draping the chain with its silver and jade charms to lay just so against his vest. He turned back to the box for the sapphires, but Will stopped him. "I've changed my mind about the sapphires, Jimmy," he said, thinking that his father shouldn't be alone in his surprise. "Certainly, my lord. The emeralds, perhaps?" "No, Jimmy," Will said, his eyes lighting up with glee as he moved to look through his jewelry box. "I have something else in mind entirely." Their guests were already in the sitting-room awaiting dinner when Hannibal came down in his evening finery. Berger had informed him of Will's color choices for the evening, but beyond that he had no idea what his mate would arrive in, and he anticipated the sight of him. He would, Hannibal knew, look profoundly incredible in anything he wore, be it a gentleman's gear in support of Miss Lowndes, or one of the delicate gowns he had purchased on impulse. But when he set eyes on Staten Graham moodily staring about the room, Hannibal rather hoped Will would wear one of his Omegan ensembles. If there was ever a night to fully embrace himself for who he was, it was a night when his father was there to see it. Lord and Lady Warrington were in pleasant conversation with Hannibal's aunt and uncle, while Mina was playing a soft tune on the harpsichord, humming to herself as she did so. Bedelia, settled with Aunt Grace and Aunt Margaret, watched Mina with hooded eyes as her mother and aunt spoke around her. She looked, to Hannibal's discerning eye, very much like a cat about to pounce on an unsuspecting canary. Considering Bedelia's eldest married son was taking singular delight in turning the Lady Rathmore's music sheets for her, Hannibal had a good idea why. Anthony spied him come in and left Freddie sitting with Uncle Robert and several more Dimmons, moving to his side with a slight, sly smile when he saw Hannibal's gaze wander back to Staten Graham.
"He's something of a killjoy, isn't he?"
he said, blowing the smoke from one of his infernal cigarettes from the side of his mouth.
"I'm rather glad of it,"
Hannibal murmured, eyes narrowing on the man in question.
"If he were anything less, that would mean he might be enjoying himself, and I won't have that."
Anthony snorted on a laugh, but was spared from answering Uncle Robert's over-loud inquiry as to the cause when the sitting-room door was opened. Hannibal scented his mate before he saw him, and was already smiling with pleasure before he even crossed the threshold. Will strode gracefully into the room, in a swirl of sweet scent, heavy brocade and frothy lace, every inch of his sturdy, supple frame on display in Omegan dress. Hannibal dragged his gaze from his trim, shapely ankles over the tight muscle of his calves, and up the length of his marvelous thighs to the narrow pinch of his waist where his jacket flared in a train behind him. The spill of his sleeves fell in layers around his corded forearms, the delicacy of the lace no match for the tender bend of his wrists or the finesse of his long fingers. The cut of his jacket echoed the curve of his waist, fastened to the vest beneath, which made a display of the smooth chest rising above. And resting against his pink-tinged porcelain skin lay the shimmering ropes of a pearl necklace dripping down his chest.
"Hannibal,"
Anthony said, patting him between the shoulders as if he choked, and he thought perhaps he had for the sound that escaped him when he saw his mate's long, slender throat draped in pearls.
"Good heavens,"
he breathed, his cheeks burning with heat, but a small secretive smile lifting the corners of his lips.
"Is this what a swoon feels like?" "It's what a swoon looks like, I know that much,"
Anthony whispered, his neck's pat hard enough to push Hannibal forward by a step.
"Will,"
Hannibal breathed, reaching to grasp Will's hand and draw him into the center of the room, the long tail of his flounced and bustled jacket drifting out behind him.
"Gods above, you look absolutely stunning."
"Do you approve?" Will asked, one eyebrow arching, the other threatening to be thoughtful should he dare not to do so. His free hand rose, fingers very deliberately touching the necklace to draw Hannibal's eyes to it once more.
"If I approve any more enthusiastically,"
Hannibal whispered, pulling his arm high to get a better look at the outfit,
"my appreciation would become the talk of the room."
Will chuckled, the raspy, soft sound music to Hannibal's ears, as beloved as the sparkle in his brilliant blue eyes.
"I am very glad you decided against the sapphires,"
Hannibal murmured, his eyes lingering on Will's throat and the scarred mark of his teeth on display for all to see.
"The brilliance of your eyes would only make them seem dim in comparison."
"Hannibal—"
"Goodness, Will, you're an absolute vision of loveliness!"
Uncle Robert boomed, interrupting Will's soft scold. He was flushed from his usual high spirits, and turned to Will's father in an excess of delight to say,
"You must be very proud."
"Oh, Papa, look how beautiful Will is,"
Mina said, her hands pausing on the keys.
"That is a lovely shade of blue, dearest. I could never wear such a shade for fear of appearing sallow."
"My dear young ladies your age are always shallow,"
Aunt Grace announced, lifting her monocle to peer at Will.
"But, Will, what a pleasure it is to finally see you in clothing which becomes you. How very handsome you are." "He certainly is, Aunt Grace,"
Hannibal said, amused by the annoyance that flashed across Mina's face and was echoed in Staten Graham's.
"I am very lucky that your beauty is a match for your mind, Will." "Quite right,"
Robert said, rushing to claim Will's hand with such haste that Hannibal feared for his own safety. He fell back with a grin, making room for his uncle to kiss Will's knuckles.
"Quite right indeed, such an exquisite jewel of a child."
"Uncle Robert, you flatter me," Will said, blushing, but when he caught his father's hateful stare, he found Uncle Robert's enthusiasm a very welcome balm to his nerves.
"Have I missed very much?"
Grandfather called, straining to see within as the door was opened. He gestured directions to the footman pushing his chair and looked at the room with a beaming smile, pleased to have so many guests after so long.
Hannibal has nearly swooned, father is an unrepentant flirt, and Lady Rathmore is shallow,
Bedelia answered, smoothing her gown.
Or so it would appear.
Sallow, my lady,
Mina corrected her, her laugh a touch nervous.
I beg your pardon, grandfather, she is sallow as well,
Bedelia said, a satisfied smirk curving her lips when Mina squeaked with horror.
You caught us all making over Lord Clarges as if we'd never seen such a thing,
Stanton said, taking a step closer, grasping his wrist behind his back so that his formidable belly preceded him.
I beg your pardon, Lord Reddig, but we haven't yet had the pleasure,
Grandfather said, sweeping a proud, approving look from Will's shoes up to his curls.
This is the first time Will has indulged us in such a treat.
I hope you didn't do it for my benefit,
Stanton said, tilting his nose in the air as if scandalized.
Lord Clarges.
My dear Lord Reddig, Aunt Margaret said, heaving to her feet with the help of her cane. Lectors never waste their efforts on a lost cause.
Aunt Margaret,
Anthony said, eyes dancing with amusement.
I dress to suit my own tastes, which pleases my husband,
Will said, watching outrage and embarrassment battle for control of his father's face. He found himself enough his father's son to enjoy the sight of it, nor was he the only one to do so.
As I am serving my purpose in this household, just as you bid me, that is to your benefit, Lord Reddig. Whatever he wants, is that not what you ordered before sending me here?
You never made such a spectacle of yourself in my house,
Stanton said, his nose wrinkling in half a sneer.
Luckily we are in Will's house,
Hannibal said, relieved to have his husband's disapproving eyebrows directed at someone else, leaving him free to admire the broad expanse of Will's chest, cradling those pearls on the barest hint of his cleavage. He slipped his arm around Will's slender waist, tucking his mate against his side, and said,
I cannot say he is the one making a spectacle of himself. I am in Omega dressed for dinner, Lord Reddig,
Will said with a small smile, standing tall and proud at Hannibal's side.
How else should I appear?
Grateful wouldn't hurt,
Stanton said, checking his pocket watch again.
It's a bit early for that, Lord Reddig, as you have not yet left us,
Hannibal said, pleased when Grandfather only smiled, his frosty amber eyes fixed on Will's father.
Your Grace, dinner is prepared,
Mr. Hawkes announced, standing in the doorway with stiff dignity.
Oh, what excellent timing you have, Mr. Hawkes,
Roland said, reaching for Will's hand to pry him out of Hannibal's grasp.
Come along, my dear. I will take you in.
The ceiling echoed with voices raised in soft conversation as they filled the dining room, disguising the sound of Will's voice when he said,
You really should not have invited him.
My dear, I had no choice,
Grandfather said, holding Will's hand in a warm grip as a footman pushed his chair into the vast, beautifully turned-out dining room.
He will be unpleasant, more than he has already been.
If he misbehaves, then we will deal with him,
Grandfather said, pulling the chair out for Will and settling him comfortably before being moved to his own place at the head of the table.
It is important for him to see that you have done well here, Will. It is important to me that he understands what a gift you are and how dearly we love you.
Will ducked his head slightly, blushing, his nerves rising again as everyone was seated along the table at comfortable intervals. Great Aunt Margaret was settled opposite from Roland, Bedelia was opposite Will's father, and the Dimmins were strung the length of the table, interspersed with Grandfather's other select guests. Will watched his father from beneath his lashes, noting that he seated Mina with appropriate care, but his expression remained pinched, sour, and entirely surly. He was only half aware of Hannibal seating himself across from him until something nudged him beneath the table. Will looked up, bewildered, and then exasperated to find Hannibal giving him a meaningful raised eyebrow and a pointed look at his necklace.
I believe your grandfather wanted you to behave, he said, an unwilling smile teasing his lips. I don't believe I'm misbehaving, am I, grandfather?
Hannibal asked, all innocence.
I've had the silver change to guard against it,
Roland said. He spared Hannibal a repressive look before gazing down the table at his gathered friends and family. When he spoke, Will heard the rumbling, echoing undertone unique to Alpha's vibrating down his spine like a physical touch.
My dear family and friends, I am so deeply grateful that you have joined us here this evening for our private celebration of my grandson's nuptials.
Roland said, pleased to have all eyes on him and silence throughout the room.
Circumstances have made this a late celebration indeed, but we are all together now, and I would like to say that Lord Reddick's loss is our gain.
He picked up his little glass of sherry and tipped it lightly at Will's father.
William Lecter, formerly William Graham, current Marquess of Clarges and future Duke of Westvale at the side of my grandson Hannibal, is a treasure of the likes I have never had the pleasure to see before, and doubt I will ever see again. So join me now in toasting to the happy union of these two dear children, and to the continuity of the Lecter line. Amor est vitae essentia.
The toast opened the way for the soup starters, and everyone settled in, chatting with their neighbors and making pleasant, light conversation. Will brought his spoon to his lips, but the scent of the soup churned his stomach, and he only feigned to sip it, nervously avoiding Hannibal's inquiring look.
Well, everyone seems to be having a wonderful time,
Hannibal said, finding he had no appetite for the soup either. He slid a little decorative bowl of sugar-glazed nuts toward Will, smiling when his mate plucked a few up to suck on, savoring their sweetness.
So far,
Grandfather said, tone guarded. The mix of family and friends was a good one, their placement designed to keep war from breaking out. Will played his part as hostess with ease, despite his usual reticence, fully aware of his father's displeasure. He seemed bewildered by Will's position in the household, and openly shocked to be referred to Will over and again in answer to his questions regarding the affairs of Hertford Town and the estate itself. He remained silently disapproving to hear his son addressed as a beloved member of the family, and it emboldened Will to put forth his best effort, even though he knew he was playing with fire.
"Did you have a very tiring journey from the capital, Lord Warrington?"
Will asked, using conversation to avoid taking anything more than nibbles of the food.
Not the least. Railing to Chesterton cuts the travel time by better than half. Such a pleasure to have quick access to the countryside, isn't it? Soon the trip shall be even shorter,
Uncle Robert said, dividing his attention between his plate and Lord Warrington.
According to our Anthony.
Indeed, Uncle Robert,
Hannibal said, smiling.
For once Anthony's dribble bears the fruit of truth. Hertford shall soon have a station of its own. Our little town is next in the stop on the path.
Oh, how delightful, Papa! Now you shall have no excuses for sequestering yourself out in the country.
No, I shall not,
Stanton said, less than pleased with the suggestion.
What an enterprising broker you must have for Hertford, your grace. I imagine it was no small feat to work that deal.
Took a good deal of time and no small amount of persuasion, Will said, shaking his head in slight refusal of a second portion of their new course. Especially to get the lifetime contract for goods, but I consider the effort nominal for the gain. I can advise you if you wish to follow our example.
That is amusing coming from you.
Amusing,
Hannibal echoed, cocking his head with a dangerous gleam in his amber eyes.
Lord Reddick, watching Will sling a trout at Hannibal's face was amusing.
Anthony laughed.
But watching him get the better of those rail representatives, that was absolutely terrifying.
Lord de Maria, certainly you jest,
Stanton asked, flummoxed.
I merely meant that it amused me to hear Lord Clarges speak as if he had personal hand in things, when clearly it was his grace or Lord Clarges who did so.
My son jokes about a great many things, Lord Reddick,
Uncle Robert said, jowls a-quiver.
But never about business. Indeed,
Hannibal said, irritated to have Will's authority questioned.
Will is the one who brokered the deal. I had no knowledge of it, and Grandfather was involved only in signing off on the purchase of properties. The station was Will's project, from inception to fruition.
Hannibal watched it sink in, enjoying every moment of Stanton's pained disbelief.
You're very brave, your grace,
Stanton finally said, attempting to rally.
Letting an Omega muck about in your business dealings.
Is that what you called it when I brought Broad River out of the negative?
Will inquired, pleased by the flush that rose on Stanton's cheeks.
You never complained of the work I did for you.
If Will hadn't taken action, we would have been fleeced blind,
Grandfather said, not nearly as well as he made himself out to be, but determined to have his say.
He uncovered numerous errors in our books and discovered our land agent was stealing from us.
Heavens, there was such a hubbub when he went to prison,
Aunt Margaret said.
Oh, yes, I hope Will makes a habit of sending to prison any person who threatens the safety of this house,
Hannibal said, lifting his wine in a small toast, his assessing golden eyes on Stanton Graham.
After he's cautioned them silly, of course.
I just find it very hard to believe what I am hearing this evening,"
Stanton said, ignoring the looks he garnered from everyone at the table.
"Having raised Will, and done the very best I could with his education, I admit I find your claims very hard to digest."
"Goodness, Lord Reddick, you sound as if you would fit in right amongst those dreadful council members,"
Uncle Robert remarked, only to be elbowed hard by Bedelia, much to his confusion.
"I am a member, as a matter of fact,"
Stanton said, craning a look around as if looking for supporters, but finding only a small silence as the dishes were cleared and the next course laid. Any hope Will had that Stanton would let the matter drop was dashed when his father said,
"The Council for the Betterment of Omegas is making great changes, and will continue to do so, if I have any say in things."
"How on earth can you propose supporting such an effort when your own child is a Megan?"
Miss Lowndes inquired, her pretty face taut with anger.
"It puts me in the particular position of having intimate knowledge of the people in question,"
Stanton said, secure in his beliefs, much to their guests' consternation,
"which makes me singularly qualified to decide what is in their best interests."
"Would you truly wish to burden your conscience with the knowledge you've deprived your own child of their rights?"
Lord Warrington asked, horrified.
"Great advancements require great sacrifices,"
Stanton said, solemn as if he'd uttered a pearl of wisdom they could not afford to ignore.
"That is a very easy thing to say when you are not the one required to make them,"
Aunt Margaret said, dropping a look of thinly veiled distaste at Lord Reddick.
"It is for the best, hurt feelings aside,"
Lord Reddick said, his appetite renewed by the topic of conversation.
"A great many council members have Omegas in their families. It isn't as if one can choose one's relatives, though I am sure it is something we've all wished for."
"Never more than at this moment, father,"
Hannibal said, abandoning his food for his wine, doing his best to prevent his bond from feeding Will too much of the simmering anger he felt. Will sat still as stone in his seat, as if he had not even heard his father speak, but his hand trembled when he lifted his glass, and he immediately put it back down, his lips pressed into a tight, unhappy line. Their placement at the table prevented Hannibal from comforting his mate, but he could feel Will's coiled tension like a spring against his skin, and he bristled in response, needing to defend him against his discomfort.
"Children,"
Roland said, tapping his knife against his glass,
"remember yourselves." "I remember a great deal, brother, but I am beside myself that I did not recognize Lord Reddick as we arrived,"
Aunt Margaret said, looking appropriately woeful.
"That was not well done of me, considering he looked precisely as he did last time I saw him."
"Oh, and how was that, my lady?"
Mina asked, eager to keep the conversation light against all expectation.
Let me see. He was stamping his foot in a dither about something or other, quite beside himself, if I recall correctly,"
Margaret said, chuckling at the memory. She angled a smirk at Stanton and added,
"Your face was as red as those roses."
"Father, you threw tantrums as a child!"
"He had just turned 30, my dear. But they do say men mature later than women, do they not?" "Better late than never at all, my lady." "You would know Lord Reddick. Do be sure to tell me the difference, should you ever find out."
"Well,"
Stanton said, partaking of his wine yet again. He had, in fact, imbibed heavily of every alcohol offered at the table, and Will saw with irritation that his nose was rather red. But there was no stopping a landslide once it started, and all he could do was sit in a shocked silence when his father said,
"I see Will has landed in a household where the manners match his own."
"We haven't any manners to speak of,"
Grace lamented, sighing wistfully.
"I do not believe you are in any position to be passing judgment on our family,"
Hannibal mildly said, raising his voice just a little over the conversation at the dinner table.
"Considering how you see fit to treat your own son in particular."
Roland put his silverware down and watched with his fingers steepled beneath his chin, his frown taut and severe.
"Just what is that supposed to mean?"
Stanton asked, flushing. "That is a rude little man," Lady Miškinis said to no one in particular, though only Hannibal and her husband understood her. Lord Miškinis broke his solemn silence to say, "Had anyone spoken at our table in such a way, I would have taken their head, Hannibal."
"Alas, that would not endear me to my mate, whatever the provocation,"
Hannibal said, garnering a sideways glance from Will and a suspicious stare from Stanton Graham.
"Lord Reddick, you're here to celebrate the successful marriage of your child into the Lecter line,"
Roland said, woodenly returning to his meal.
"I realize I am asking you for the impossible, but do try to be pleasant." You say that, your grace, but we are here 6 years later, and all my family has gotten from this successful marriage is fodder for the gossips,
Stanton said, gesturing impatiently at his wine-glass so that a footman scrambled to fill it.
Your precious grandson made Will a laughing-stock.
As you are attempting to do?
Lady Warrington asked, irritated with his performance. Hannibal plastered a calm smile on and said,
I understand that you are concerned for the treatment Will has received since his arrival.
I have very little interest in how you treat him, except for the gossip it engenders,
Stanton said, and Hannibal saw Will tense across from him, a flare of temper flashing across his impassive face.
I am more concerned that his sister is unhappy and would have been much better served being a duchess-in-waiting than Lady Rathmore.
Father! Mina gasped, the only sound in an otherwise stunned silence.
I could take his head for you,
Lord Miškinis offered, and his wife gave him a reproving look across the table.
No, thank you, uncle. I appreciate the offer, however. Mina made her choice,
Will said, his even voice carrying through the room.
As you made yours. There is very little sense in dwelling on what has already passed, as I am painfully aware it solves nothing. May we please carry on with our celebration?
Stanton glared at him, blue eyes unwavering and so forceful that Hannibal stirred a little, wishing to shield Will from his father.
I half expected you would be dead from what your sister wrote me.
Father! Mina cried again, mortified, and Will flinched, his stubborn chin lifting a fraction as every pair of eyes fastened on Stanton Graham. Hannibal cast a curious glance over at Will, the rest of the family following the direction of his gaze, including those perfectly able to understand the language they preferred not to use.
Will?
After my accident, I wrote to Mina. I confided my fears in her. I never imagined she would speak of those fears to anyone else.
I was petrified for you, Will,
Mina stammered, her hand trembling so hard she sloshed wine over the glass and had to set it down.
Those things you have told me.
Things?
Uncle Robert bellowed, concerned.
What things?
Apparently, someone stole into this house and shoved my son down the stairs,
Stanton said, his smirk unpleasant. His voice rose to fill the dining room, ensuring he was heard by all present.
I assumed Lord Clarges had finally decided to wash his hands of him.
As you can see, I wish to do no such thing,
Hannibal said, interrupting him before he could say anything more hurtful to Will than he already had.
It was an accident, Lord Reddig. That is all. Stairs?
Aunt Grace asked, the word echoing down the length of the table like a doomsday bell.
It is astonishing how your hearing improves when you so desire, Aunt Grace.
Why is this the first we're hearing of it?
Uncle Robert demanded, exchanging a shocked look with his son.
Will, what on earth?
Anthony asked, everyone beginning to speak at once.
I was also informed of a girth strap that was cut,
Stanton said, his smile malicious as he gazed at Will, who looked back at him with bland indifference and sipped his wine, refusing to be ruffled.
The fall he took could have broken his neck.
This is outrageous.
Hannibal, what on earth is that man saying? He is speaking too fast.
Everyone, please,
Grandfather said, the alpha boom in his voice deep enough to silence even those who profess not to hear well. He managed a long stare that quieted the table at once.
I will not have our guests believe us quarrelsome folk.
Nonsense, Grandfather, Bedelia said, her slight cat-like smile firmly in place.
We are all intimate acquaintances, are we not?
Roland warily said.
Indeed.
Then there is no reason to govern ourselves as if we are amongst strangers,
Bedelia added, transferring her cold stare to Will's father.
Is there?
Young lady,
Stanton said, bristling up like a bulldog.
I would doubt very much you would know how to govern yourself in the first place.
Lord Reddig, Will sharply said, reproaching his father's rude speech.
No well-bred gentleman would ever speak to a lady in such a way.
Well, then I suppose that calls into question your breeding, does it not?
Stanton asked, shocking the table all over again.
Honestly, as if this family could hope to lecture me on proper behavior. Ha! Since Will has come to this house, he has been cast off, embarrassed, shamed before the entirety of society, deeply abused by his husband, and pushed down a flight of stairs.
Indeed he has,
Hannibal said, his words clipped with tight anger.
Such an improvement, really, from how he was treated in your house, Lord Reddig. He is grateful on a daily basis, to be sure.
Stanton's head whipped around, blue eyes fastening on Hannibal with something akin to hatred in their depths.
"Do not play the outraged father for us, if you please,"
Hannibal said, glaring right back at him.
"You are unconvincing at best and embarrassing at worst."
Everyone seated at the table stared at Staton Graham with varying degrees of disbelief and open dislike, silent and disapproving of his behavior to such an extent that he finally realized he was the object of their censure, not his son. When the low criticism began, Staton turned a most interesting shade of deep red that nearly bordered on purple. Hannibal was fiendishly pleased to see it.
"I refuse to be spoken to in this way,"
Staton said, and surged to his feet, the silverware rattling on the table.
"How dare you all judge me as if I am the one who is at fault?"
"From what anyone can see here, sir,"
Uncle Robert said, verbalizing their affront,
"you are."
Staton opened his mouth to refute it, but was prevented by Will's sharp voice ordering, "Sit down, Lord Reddick." The words cracked like a whip, bringing another sudden hush to the table. Will drew a deep breath, his restless fingers turning his glass around and around. He gazed at his father with steady disapproval and informed him, "You are our guest, invited if not welcomed. Dessert is here, and we should all enjoy it. If you do not like what you have been served, Lord Reddick, then I can only assume you prefer to do the serving. Please do not complain when it is portioned back to your plate."
"How dare you?"
"How dare I?" Will echoed, his eyebrows slamming down over his narrowed eyes. "How dare you? Speaking on events which you have no knowledge, as if you have ever spared a moment's concern for my well-being. Now sit down, Lord Reddick. You have had your say, and now you will reap the reward for your appalling behavior. Sit!" Hannibal tensed when Stanton's hand rose, clenched into a fist, an involuntary movement as he stared at his son. Will stared back at him and took a slow sip of his wine, blue eyes fastened on his father, unimpressed with his bluster.
"It will be the last thing you ever do,"
Hannibal softly promised, his words a low purr in the stunned silence.
"Staton,"
Grandfather warned, entering the fray again, despite his determination they should sort it for themselves.
"Father,"
Mina said, raising her gloved hand to Staton's arm.
"please sit. You're making a scene."
With his righteous exit denied him, there was no choice but to sit and bear the condemnation of those whose dinner he had disrupted so rudely. Floored with impotent rage and embarrassment, Staton allowed himself to be coaxed to sit, twitching with every glance and whisper. The staff leapt into action, moving to serve the dessert course, professionals to the bitter end, and their dinner settled once more into routine calm.
"Well,"
Hannibal said, managing to catch his husband's hard eyes. He smiled his encouragement as their dessert was placed before them, noting that Will yet again took no more than the smallest of bites from his dessert.
"That was entertaining."
"I'm afraid this night hasn't gone as we could wish," Will said, sipping the dessert wine to chase the sweetness of the cake from his mouth. His eyes flicked to Grandfather, who looked worn and drained. "I apologize, Grandfather, for his behavior as well as my own."
"There is nothing in your own behavior you should apologize for, Will,"
Grandfather said, glowering at Staton, who sat like a dark stain at the table, resisting his daughter's attempts to lighten the mood.
"And nothing surprising in regards to your father's. He has always been an unpleasant boy. Takes after his mother, who was as sour as a lemon and had the disposition of a billy goat."
"Having expected disaster, I admit I am pleasantly surprised,"
Hannibal said, coaxing a small, tired smile from his husband.
"We are none of us dead, and no one imprisoned. I should say that is a success."
"It is in this house,"
Grandfather said, and reached over to pat Will's hand.
"Perhaps you could take the ladies to the drawing room."
"Yes, Grandfather," Will said, and a footman appeared in an instant to draw his chair back as he stood. He cast a smile down the table. "Ladies, shall we retire to the drawing room for coffee? Gentlemen, the brandy will be served here for you all." He felt his father's glare like daggers in his back as he led the ladies from the room, and he silently dreaded the next few days that Staton was expected to stay.
"Father is livid,"
Mina whispered, walking at his side as the ladies trailed behind in murmured conversation.
"I was so worried when I saw he was to come. I cannot imagine he should stay here, Will. Surely one of you will not survive it."
"I find that a reasonable outcome, Mina, provided I am the one who survives." The gentleman joined them in the drawing-room some time later, finding a pleasant atmosphere of smiles and laughter far removed from the tension of the dining-room. But neither Hannibal nor Stanton was among them, much to Will's surprise. He excused himself and moved immediately to Grandfather's side. "Where is Hannibal?"
"He invited Lord Reddig on a tour of Hertford House, my dear,"
Grandfather murmured, giving a reassuring smile to their other guests.
"Shortly after you left us."
"Oh dear," Will breathed, casting a nervous glance toward the door as the gentleman settled in among them. "Do you think he's thrown Lord Reddig from the parapets?"
"Oh, I do hope so,"
Grandfather said, patting his hand. Will took advantage of the momentary disruption their arrival caused, and handed his cup off to a passing footman before he slipped out of the drawing-room. The panel muted the sounds within as it closed behind him, leaving him alone with his anxiety over what his father might say, what Hannibal might yet do. Worry hastened his step as he moved through the dark hallways, looking for any sign of them. He found the library door cracked open, spilling light out into the dim hallway in a runner of gold bisecting the polished floor. Will stopped before it, hearing the unmistakable sound of his father's voice. Apprehension kept him from passing the threshold, an unmarked shadow to the two men inside.
"Would you care to tell me now why you've walked me all over this house instead of taking brandy like a gentleman?"
Stanton asked, the words clipped and sharp enough that Will held his breath. He pressed against the door panel, peering in to see his husband's broad back and his father's round, angry face just beyond.
"You needed to work off your temper, and I wanted to show you the changes Will has brought to Hartford,"
Hannibal said, pouring the man a brandy and pushing it toward him over the massive desk.
"I thought it might interest you to see the profound positive effect he's worked here since his arrival."
Stanton took the glass up, affronted, but it did not prevent him from drinking it.
"Why should you care what I see of him, or what I think of him?"
"I couldn't give 2 figs for your opinion of him, that much is true,"
Hannibal admitted, sipping his brandy.
"In the grand scheme of things, you don't matter in the least, and I won't concern myself with you. But it is important to me that deep down in that black heart of yours you understand how badly you've misjudged him, and comprehend the terrible mistakes you've made where he is concerned."
Stanton guffawed, a sneer wrinkling his nose as he said,
"You're a besotted fool, Lord Clarges. Your clarity of thought and ability to reason were lost the moment you let him seduce you."
"It pains me to realize how like you I was,"
Hannibal said, repressing a shudder that Will could read in the set of his shoulders.
"But we are the fools, Lord Reddig, though I am less so now. Very luckily for me, Will couldn't stand for such nonsense."
He sipped his own brandy, gathering his thoughts before he said,
"Will came here as a child, terrified and alone, and without any help or support from anyone at all, he took this entire estate in hand and dragged it from the brink of ruin. That isn't something just anyone can do, Lord Reddig. Surely even you can admit how clever he is."
"If you wish praise for his virtues, you are speaking to the wrong man,"
Stanton said, his voice raised in an unhappy hiss that made Will's skin tighten with dread even still.
"And for all your snide remarks, you seemed eager enough to meet me. Why was that, Lord Clarges? Change of heart regarding the council?"
"Certainly not. It is simple enough, Lord Reddig. I wanted to see the man who had done such terrible harm to my husband. I wanted to look into your face and know that something truly evil walks the earth."
"I have only ever treated Will with the strict correction his nature required,"
Stanton said, putting his glass down with a loud clink that nearly shattered it.
"No, you treated him as if he was something inhuman,"
Hannibal said, lowering his drink.
"You treated him with a savagery you wouldn't show a beast. You bent his mind to your design and did everything in your power to see him broken beyond repair."
Hannibal ran his finger around the rim of his glass, an absent gesture that still managed to be somewhat menacing.
"Yet all of your attempts to diminish him have only made Will shine all the brighter,"
Hannibal said, a slight smile on his lips, a softness suffusing him at the mention of his mate.
"Everything that life has heaped upon his head, every horror you or I have devised to ruin him, Will has handled with a grace and dignity I doubt either one of us could ever manage."
Will saw Hannibal delve into his pocket and draw forth something that made his father's eyes widen.
"What on earth is this?"
Stanton asked, nostrils flaring, his eyes narrowing to suspicious slits.
"This,"
Hannibal said, holding out a check so that Stanton could see the sum,
"is the dowry Will arrived with, plus interest for the years of our marriage."
"I don't understand. Are you attempting to return him?"
"I would sooner die." Will's dowry, in his own words, was to compensate for the burden of his care. I would no more accuse him of being a burden than I would accuse you of being a father to him, and so I return it in full."
Staton stared at him, equal parts offended and greedy.
"From the moment Will arrived here, he has managed Hertford House and all of its business dealings,"
Hannibal said, holding the check out with his fingertips as if the idea of touching Staton even in passing was abhorrent. His bonds seethed with deep outrage and anger, but none of it showed on his calm, smooth face. He appeared entirely unaffected, which made him all the more dangerous.
"He has brought this estate into a wealth of the likes our family hasn't seen in generations, and he has done so in less than 10 years.
"So, you wish to keep him because he makes you money,"
Staton sneered, plucking the check up and folding it to slide it carefully into his pocket.
"No,"
Hannibal said, cocking his head.
"It was simply an explanation I thought you would understand, as I doubt an emotional attachment would make sense to you, monster that you are. The truth is, Will is a treasure without equal, Lord Reddig. Had he come with nothing but the clothes on his back, I would still have gained a fortune in him. The man I married, the boy you sent me, the child you abused so harshly that I struggled daily not to call you out for it. He is infinitely more precious to me than the sum of the world's wealth. I am grateful with every breath that you are a loathsome, self-serving pig of a man who schemed to deliver Will into my hands rather than his sister. For what purpose, I still have my doubts."
Staton trembled with suppressed rage, incensed that the child he'd sent with every intention of failing had, instead, won a place of such high regard with a man who would one day hold great power in their country.
"Will is wondrous and precious and perfect, the sun and the moon of my world. Should he ever ask it of me, I would find a way to have you stripped of your title and holdings, and turned out into the street like the pathetic excuse of a man you are. Remember that when you speak of him and of what he means to you, Lord Reddig, be grateful that my husband holds such sway over me, that he keeps me from a retaliation which would satisfy me to no end."
Staton's mouth worked with impotent rage, his cheeks florid.
"Do you honestly believe I will stand here and be insulted?"
he asked, drawing up with offended dignity.
"How dare you speak to me as if that creature's failings were on my head? You can tell that wretched child he is no longer a part of this family, for good and all."
"You're right, he isn't,"
Hannibal said, and Will pressed his hand to his heart, swallowing hard against the tears that tightened his throat, when the bonds surged with fury and wrenching love in equal measure.
"He is a lector, Lord Reddig. He is our family now, and we are his, and we are a jealous, vicious people when it comes to protecting those we love. Because make no mistake."
He took a step closer to Staton, who stepped backwards before he could stop himself, eyes widening in shock to see Hannibal transformed with cold rage.
"I love Will with everything in me, and there is nothing I would not do for him. Nothing."
"How dare you threaten me?"
"It was not a threat, Lord Reddig, but a promise,"
Hannibal corrected, tipping his head back to look down his noble nose at Will's father.
"If you come into his presence, you will do so with a smile. If he asks you a question, you will answer him politely. If your opinion is sought, you will not offend him with your ignorance. You will at all times be pleasant and agreeable where he is concerned, because if you choose not to do so, I will take the things you consider more important than your son. I will buy your debts one by one. I will close your lines of credit with every merchant you do business with, and I will sink you like a ship at sea, because it is in my power to do so, and I value his happiness far more than I value your life."
Will caught his breath, the force of Hannibal's love for him and fury on his behalf, calling through the deepest instincts he held, an Omega's response to their Alpha's display, a husband's pride in his spouse's strength.
"For the remainder of your life, you will treat Will with the effusive, polite respect you would show to a stranger, Lord Reddig, because that is what he is to you, and in this we can agree,"
Hannibal said, the words rumbling so deep in Will's chest he felt them all the way through his very bones.
"He is not your son. He is my husband, and we are a family. His home is with me as mine is with him, and I will always protect him, not because he needs it, but because he is irreplaceable to me."
Staton smirked an ugly and cruel little smile and said, "We'll see." He moved toward the door, and Will backed away, slipping into the shadows with his hand still pressed to his pounding heart, as if he could touch the bond itself. He took one dragging breath and then another, the solid thump of his father's footsteps fading as he mounted the stairs, snarling at the footman who offered to guide the way. He heard the quiet clink of the decanter again, and quickly made his way back to the drawing-room, where only his sister had remarked his disappearance.
"You're quite flushed, Will,"
she whispered, reaching up to smooth his curls.
"I thought at first Father had upset you again, but you seem, happy."
"Do I?" he asked, breathless and shaken, trying his best to pay attention to her. But he couldn't focus on anything. His hand moved over and over to press to his heart, fingers sliding over the little pearls, palm catching the reverberation of Hannibal's sincerity and deep respect as he made his position clear to Will's father.
"He is a lector, Lord Reddig. He is our family now, and we are his, and we are a jealous, vicious people when it comes to protecting those we love."
Hannibal could have found no better way to wound his father had he 1,000 years to consider it. Stanton had sent Will here to live in misery for the rest of his days, tied to an alpha who despised him, reviled for who he was. He had arrived hoping to see Will belittled in his own household, made a mockery of, spoken down to, and largely ignored, and instead he found the child he despised to be admired, treated with dignity and respect, his opinion sought, and his advice valued. And just when he might have been imagining a way to use Will's status to his advantage, Hannibal had tossed the dowry back to him with disdain for its meaning, and made it clear that Stanton would find no welcome, his sins neither forgotten nor forgiven. Hannibal had fought in his place, attempting to spare him the battle entirely, and the love he'd spoken of with such passion still made Will dizzy with its strength. It carried him through the chatter, through everyone retiring for the night against the late hour. He virtually floated up to his suite, so absent-minded that Jimmy teased him in that gentle way he had, saying, "Your evening certainly took a turn for the better, my lord, judging by that smile." "It did," Will agreed, retreating to his dressing-room to undress. He spied his nightclothes laid out on the bed, the simple shirt and pants he usually wore for the sake of warmth. "Has Hannibal come up?" Jimmy nodded, intent on Will's buttons.
"He has, my lord. Berger said he was in a mood, so he fetched some brandy for him. He isn't abed yet."
Will bit his lower lip in thought, reaching for the nightshirt and rubbing the fine material between his fingers.
"And I will always protect him, not because he needs it, but because he is irreplaceable to me."
"Is something the matter, my lord?"
"No, only I should like to visit my husband tonight," Will said, his cheeks pinking up but his tone firm.
Jimmy blinked, a small smile playing around his lips. "I think I know just the thing."
It took Hannibal a long time to calm himself from his encounter with Stanton Graham. He trembled with rage every time he thought of that insufferable monster being anywhere near Will, but steeled himself to bear it for now. Will would have his say before it was over. Hannibal was determined on that count. He only hoped he was there to witness his mate's righteous fury come down on Stanton's head like a hammer. He would catch hell from grandfather come morning, he knew, for not joining their guests in the sitting-room after dinner, but he shunted that concern aside to wait for morning. He was in no state for any company but that of his mate, and he had no wish to burden Will with his bristling, not with the bond making things that much more keenly felt. He settled in his armchair before the fire with a sigh, staring into the flames with weary consideration. Speaking to Stanton of dowries and seeing the man who had sent Will to him with such ill intent brought Hannibal to unhappy reflection of his own behavior. He was so deeply lost in thoughts of the past that he was taken by surprise when a soft knock came on the washroom door. He straightened in his seat, heart pounding, and called out,
"Enter."
The door opened, an eddy of Will's sweet, lush scent teasing his nose. Hannibal swallowed reflexively, transported to that night nearly 7 years ago, when Will had come to him, bared down to his soul and trembling with fear, only to be torn into like a hapless fawn. The Omega coming toward him was no child sent to woo him, not any more. He emerged from the shadows like a fantasy made of moonlight, pale and beautiful, the hem of his silken wrapper swirling around his trim ankles. Hannibal caught his gaze and held it, heart pounding even harder when he saw the determination reflected in Will's beautiful, expressive eyes.
"Will,"
he breathed, the only prayer he needed, the only wish he could ever ask to be fulfilled. Say it for me, Hannibal, Will whispered, slowing as he neared but not stopping, graceful and breathtaking in his strength. Please. Hannibal wet his lips, amber eyes glinting with growing hope. There was no hesitation in him when he answered, I love you, Will. Always and forever, I love you. Will stopped there, just before him, near enough that Hannibal could see the line of his body through the nearly sheer material, solid and supple and firm. There was no trace of the boy he'd been anywhere to be seen, but he was still in there, hidden in the deepest parts of Will's heart, still stinging with the pain Hannibal had inflicted on him. Hannibal angled his head up as Will reached out to cup his face, the warmth of his palm settling against his cheek with tender care. There was no doubt in his mind that the moment had come, the decision he had longed for and dreaded and hoped for with such passion that it frightened him to finally realize it was here. Ask me, Hannibal, Will whispered, standing between Hannibal's spread legs and gazing down at him with an intensity that shook Hannibal to his very soul. Ask me. Hannibal held his gaze unblinking, heart bared to his mate in every syllable. Will you have me, Will? Always and forever?